Hi, World History. I'm going to tell you all about the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, and our relationship with Iraq today, which, as you can see, is a slightly confusing tale. So I'm going to do the best here I can to kind of explain all that and how hopefully have you understand just the complex nature that is the U.S. relationship with this area. So if you haven't already, you might want to get your study guide out just because we're going to go through a couple of people and terms. We're going to start off by reviewing a little bit here of what we've already learned, and that is that the Iranians had a revolution in 1979, which led to this guy, Ayatollah Khomeini, coming into power. And we also have already studied what he stood for and what he was about. He's definitely a fundamentalist Islamic leader who really wanted to rid Iran of a lot of their foreign influences and kind of bring back a more conservative theocracy. So the U.S. Embassy was raided and our citizens were held hostage, as we saw in our clip of the movie Argo, until the day Ronald Reagan took in the Oval Office here and took the oath of the presidency in 1981. So the bottom line was our relationship with Iran was not so good because of this event, and you can, understand why. So when we're going to see here that the Iran-Iraq War is going to go on from 1980 to 1988. And so this is when, of course, Iran, who we definitely don't like, is fighting their neighbor of Iraq. And this is when the United States sort of takes that philosophy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This picture is kind of crazy when you think about what this meant later. But this is our, at the time, he was in the CIA, and now he is not now, but under the Iraq War in 2003, he was our Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who led the campaign to basically get rid of Saddam Hussein. But here he is shaking hands with Saddam Hussein. So this really shows that we were willing to work with Iran's enemies to undermine them in the region. So now, we definitely helped, as you can see, provided help to Saddam Hussein and his regime in Iraq. And Saddam, it wasn't any real secret here that he wasn't a good guy. He used chemical weapons against his own people, a Kurdish minority living within Iraq in 1988, killing 30,000 people. So it's not like we were surprised later in the 2000s that, oh my gosh, Saddam's a bad guy. I think that was pretty clear early on, But I think the bigger threat for us was Iran. And so we were definitely trying to, I think, check Iran's power. This is a devastating war for the region. It's really going to do a lot to disrupt the lives of civilians and not to mention waste a lot of really valuable resources. So the United States is definitely playing a role there. Now I want to pause for a moment and just talk about the ethnic makeup of Iraq. So in Iraq, what we see is it's almost like three countries in one. And remember, who drew these boundaries? Well, these boundaries were drawn after World War I. These are the mandates that were created with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So Iraq was created, and it's really like three countries in one. You've got about 60% of the population that are Shia Muslims. You've got about 30% of the population that are Sunni Muslims. And Saddam himself was a Sunni. He was not very devoutly religious. In fact, Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein did not get along at all. Osama bin Laden really thought Saddam was not religious enough. But technically he was a Sunni. Now he's part of the minority though, and he's ruling over the majority of people. So what do we know historically about a person who's a minority leader ruling over the majority? Well, you probably have to use some violence, or at least the threats of violence, to keep power because you're outnumbered. There's about 10% of people in Iraq who are ethnically Kurdish. It's kind of like a nation without a state. So they're a group of people that lived mostly in the north, and they were the ones targeted by Saddam in 1988 with those gas attacks. So Saddam had made it pretty clear how he felt about them, and really how he felt about anybody who stood in his way. I mean, terror was used often under the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq. So why are we working with this guy? Again, we're working with him because Iran is the bigger threat at that point. But once the Iran-Iraq war is over, there's not a whole lot of a reason to continue to support Saddam Hussein, especially after he used chemical weapons, and then he takes it one step further and invaded Kuwait in August 1990. So let me go back to this slide and just show you where Kuwait is. Here's the country of Kuwait right there. One of the wealthiest countries in the world to this day, and that's because they are a major oil producer. Here's the Persian Gulf. So notice Iraq just has a teeny tiny little area there of access to the Persian Gulf. So if you're Saddam Hussein, can you see why you might want to invade here? It's going to be a lot easier to get to the Persian Gulf, right? So what Saddam accused Kuwait of creating an underground pipeline to steal his oil. And that was sort of what he used as his justification to invade Kuwait in August 1990. Well, the United Nations, which was led by a lot of U.S. leadership here, the U.S. was pushing for this, gave him an ultimatum, and he wouldn't get out. So this is when we saw the UN, led by quite a few U.S. forces, invading to Iraq to get Saddam out of Kuwait in January 1991. So notice I didn't say to get Saddam out of power, because that wasn't the goal in 1991. What we were attempting to do here was check his power, get him out of Kuwait, push him back, and basically let him know that he's not in charge, that the world and the United Nations were really watching him. So one of the first things Iraq did, which is just another reminder of how much most countries in the region despise Israel, is they launched missiles at Israel for supporting the United States. So just, to kind of like get at Israel. They did that during the war. So the war itself wasn't very long. It was over in just a matter of months, minimal U.S. casualties. But I think the United States really hoped the Iraqi people would rise up against Saddam. But this just didn't happen. We didn't see like massive widespread uprising against Saddam Hussein. Why is that? Well, I would really say it's because those people were afraid. They were terrified of Saddam Hussein. I mean, this is a guy that had used chemical weapons against his own people. This is a guy that had torture chambers and prisons, spoke out. Anybody who spoke out against him was killed. So can you blame him, really, for not just rising up? I think the people were afraid for that. So I think the U.S. was really hoping that Saddam would just go here, but he doesn't. So I have up here a quote by our former Vice President Cheney. At the time, he was Secretary of Defense when this happened. And I think this sums it up nicely, so let me just read this to you here. He's talking about, should we have gotten rid of Saddam? And he says, and the final point I think needs to be made is this question of casualties. I don't think you could have done all that, meaning get rid of Saddam, without significant additional U.S. casualties. And while everybody was tremendously impressed with the low cost of the 1991 conflict, for the 146 Americans who were killed in action, and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question in my mind is, how many additional American casualties is Saddam worth? And the answer is, not that damn many. So I think we got it right, both when we decided to expel him from Kuwait, but also when the president made the decision that we'd achieved our objectives, and we were not going to go get bogged down in the problems of trying to take over and govern Iraq. So this is what he says in 1982. He's saying it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth the additional American casualties to get him out, not to mention getting bogged down in the problems of trying to take over and govern Iraq. Well, here's the thing, okay? He held together a very fragmented country, and I think that's what Cheney was really saying. I mean, he was a pretty rotten guy. He used pretty horrible ways, but I think, you got to remember, in 1991, we were watching the Soviet Union fall apart, guys. We were watching the Iron Curtain crumble and people rising up and winning, and I think President Bush Sr. kind of felt like, well, that's going to happen here too, right? And I think everybody sort of held their breath that it'll just happen and Saddam will be gone and we won't have to worry about him. And when that doesn't happen, we were disappointed. So we're going to make that decision to leave Saddam in power despite the fact that we know he's a pretty rotten guy. And we're going to make that decision really until September 11, 2001. Okay, back me up here. Saddam Pringles guy. I know I already used this with Stalin, but I mean, I don't know. I'm thinking I'm seeing a pattern here. Mustached dictators. Anyway, so the results here, Saddam got out of Kuwait. And so the policy became known as declawing the tiger. Now, if you take a tiger's claws out of his paws, he can still growl at you, right? He can still talk a pretty big game. He can still act all tough. But he's not going to be able to hurt you as much. And so that's, I think, really what our attitude was. We checked Saddam's power. We smacked him on the wrist, said, get out of Kuwait. Bad Saddam. And he did. And for the next few years, we're going to continue to keep an eye on him. We're going to bomb strategic targets in Iraq anytime he violated any no-fly zones. So we were watching him, but we weren't really willing to get him because, as Vice President Cheney said, it was going to be hard. It was going to require more American casualties. Well, then everything changed. Okay, and this is the significance of September 11, 2001. This changed everything because I think what we're going to see then is it's George W. Bush who's in charge. And he's going to start to say, you know what? We can't just let guys like Saddam Hussein stay in power. If there's a guy in power who's a rotten guy, and he's proving that he's not afraid to use chemical weapons, and he's proving that he's encouraging acts of terror and anti-American feelings, then President George W. Bush said, it is in our national interest to get rid of this guy. We have to get rid of this guy. So to be clear, Saddam Hussein did not order this stuff, okay? This guy did. This is Osama bin Laden. He was the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. He was the one that took credit for it. Joyfully, I might add, on a video that he released that day. He's the one that did it. But what we're going to start to see the U.S. say is, okay, anyone who sympathizes with this guy is now a threat. So whereas we were willing to overlook what Saddam did before and say, yeah, he's not good, but, he's technically not threatening us, well, that's what September 11 changes. Now anybody who isn't good is a potential threat. And now we're gonna go places. Now we're gonna go to Iraq. Okay? So again, did Saddam order the 9/11 attacks? No, he did not. I'm sure he was happy that day. Al-Qaeda was the group that ordered the 9/11 attacks. But his regime had been sympathetic to the cause, and according to U.S. intelligence, helped fund groups tied to Al-Qaeda. There was some evidence that Saddam was encouraging suicide bombers. That was the kind of thing that was now making him almost guilty by association. So this is why we see the war on terror. First, the U.S. went to Afghanistan, not Iraq, because in Afghanistan, we're going to see that's where the Taliban was. And the Taliban is that radical government in Afghanistan that was encouraging Osama bin Laden, allowing Al-Qaeda to train there. That's why we said, okay, we're going there first, for sure. Then we were going to start to expand into anywhere else that was a threat. So here's our Secretary of State Colin Powell at the United Nations making the case that the UN should go to Iraq. And why? Well, here's what he said. There are WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, that U.S. intelligence showed were in Iraq. And he said, look, we know they're there. We know Saddam is trying to get the capability to hit us. And we need to get involved. Here's the thing, though. We have not yet found these WMDs. So that's the thing that some people were hesitant, and the United Nations ultimately said, we disagree with you. We don't think there's enough evidence to show. So the United States then did something that was pretty controversial at the time and still remains to be pretty controversial. President George W. Bush said, then I don't care. I'm going, and I will invite anybody who wants to come with us. So he called it the Coalition of the Willing. Any countries that felt that Saddam was a threat who want to go in. Interestingly enough, a lot of Eastern European countries supported President Bush's decision and, often said, we know what it's like to live in a brutal regime. So yeah, we'll go help you out. Countries like Poland and Hungary who sort of lived behind that Iron Curtain. So this was why this war was pretty polarizing in the UN. I think a lot of our traditional allies were pretty kind of upset by our decision to essentially ignore the United Nations and go it alone. Okay, and not alone. Like I said, there was a group of countries that were willing to go, but it was sort of overriding the UN. So that's exactly what happened. We launched an invasion of Iraq, and there were several other countries there too, but the United States had the majority of troops. And Saddam was overthrown in April 2003, and this is the statue of him being pulled down. So this was a pretty big deal, pretty exciting thing. I mean, it kind of felt like scenes we saw when that Iron Curtain fell apart. But since then, this is the trouble. It's been hard to get control of the country because, again, Iraq, remember, it's almost like three countries in one, right? So you've got that part of it, the part that's very ethnically divided, and you also have insurgents who are people who are basically going against the law, determined to hurt the peace process. So insurgent groups do things like go to the police station, and while people are signing up to become new police officers to protect everyone in Iraq, they bomb them. They make it so scary for people to stand up and say they want help. That's what insurgents do. So it's really slowing the peace process. So I want to get into Arab Spring, but I'm going to probably do that in a different slideshow because it's almost a different kind of topic here. So hopefully you understand here our relationship with Iran and Iraq and the Persian Gulf War and how September 11th played a big role. It really is kind of confusing, but I think it's probably one of the most important things you need to understand before you leave my class. So hope that helped.